My name is Aaron Burke. I am the president of the Los Angeles County Archaeological Institute of America chapter, and it's my pleasure this evening. We are here on April 13th, 2022, to introduce our speaker for tonight, James Osborne, who comes to us from the University of Chicago, longtime friend and colleague many years back, longer than I think we want to start to remember, admit how long things go back, but it's a pleasure to have him this evening. And this series is a part of the kinds of talks that we inaugurated during the pandemic, and something that we're continuing now as things in many places get back to normal, and people are splitting themselves between a sort of virtual presence and online presence. But we consider them very important part of our contribution as a society, a local chapter of the Archaeological Institute of America, because they give an opportunity to our speakers to present on their research, a kind of abstract of recent books that reach across global archaeology. And it may be the case that you're not an expert in the Levant or Anatolia or the Near East, but can find something here that is particularly sort of resonant with your own work, and thereby something that you will find interesting and can pull into different circles. So I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction here to give you a little bit of background to Dr. Osborne and his research. Dr. Osborne began his studies as a bachelor's at the University of Toronto, 2003, then moved on to Harvard, where he received his master's, focusing specifically on the archaeology of the Levant in 2008, and completed his PhD there under Lawrence Steger in 2011, and writing on spatial analysis and political authority in the Iron Age kingdom of Patina in Turkey, where he has continued to work and in nearby areas. He has published a number of edited volumes now that have become, sort of centerpieces of very what I think of as a sort of anthropological integration in Near Eastern archaeology, something that has really, sort of taken off the last 20 years that was sort of absent in our kind of cultural historical approach in earlier times, certainly in the 20th century, and it really has brought a new depth and dimension to the field. In particular, he's got an edited volume with Van Valkenburg in 2013, Territoriality in Archaeology. Some of this obviously plays into his ongoing research and what he'll be talking about today. And also an edited volume in 2014, Approaching Monumentality in Archaeology, that many have engaged with, including myself, because of the perspective it provides on monumentality, which isn't all about the biggest things, but emphasizes the importance of what we mean when we're using terms like monumentality. He's actively involved in the archaeology of Syro-Anatolia, and that really shows in this most recent book that we're going to be looking at today, the Syro-Anatolian City-States, an Iron Age culture, looking specifically at this Syro-Anatolian cultural complex that he will define more specifically for us. I won't even begin to enumerate the many wonderfully incisive peer-reviewed articles that he's got to his credit. He's a model of production, and I always enjoy engaging with these. I will mention that in addition to working at the site of Tel Tayanat in the Amuk for a number of years, he is now starting to launch his own project in a little bit to the northwest of that, right, in southern Anatolia. Let me grab the name here, Turkmen Karahuyuk. It's an intensive survey project is the full name. And that has yielded some really interesting results that, sort of, I guess, become almost a platform for testing some of the concepts you lay out in this book. So, without further ado, I want to turn this over to James to present to us, and we'll have some follow-on questions afterwards and keep this in a kind of informal setting. So we hope you will look forward to this. Thank you, James, and take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much, Aaron, for that. And to you both, Ken and Aaron, for inviting me here in the first place. I'm just going to share this screen now. Let's see. Here we go. So in theory, you should all be able to see my PowerPoint, right? Yeah, good. Excellent. Yeah, it's really kind of you to invite me to this. And it's always fun to talk about my book. I really appreciated you holding up a physical copy. Glad to see someone out there actually bought one. I think there's probably a couple others out there, but otherwise, I think it's probably not on Amazon's top sellers list. But part of the reason for that, of course, is that it's about a region and a time and place that is fairly obscure, even to Near Eastern archaeologists, really. The northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea, basically, is where a dozen or so Iron Age kingdoms existed. And I'll give you a better sense of the chronology and the geography in just a minute. The main point of the book really is that these particular kingdoms have a tendency to be mischaracterized by scholarship. And they tend to be portrayed as if they were 3,000-year-old versions of modern Western Europe, as if each one of these city-states operated as a distinct sort of nation state with a tightly demarcated boundary, inside of which was one ethnic group and outside of which was a different ethnic group. And really, a simple empirical analysis of the material that's there shows that that is not an accurate representation, and that we need to turn to other models in the nation state. In other words, this is why I'm calling it uncooperative nation states, which will make more sense in a minute, I hope. Really, we need some kind of model that incorporates a sense of shared identity and hybrid cultural practices to accurately really encapsulate the data that we have available. So just to orient us chronologically and geographically then, I'm not going to elaborate in any detail, really, the cultural formations and the time periods that I'm just going to blast through in just 1 minute here. But just so that we're on the same page chronologically and geographically, I just wanted to give you a sense of where we are. So obviously we're looking at a map of Turkey here and surrounding countries, Syria and Iraq, and the Mediterranean and Black Sea. And in the late Bronze Age, which is more or less the late 2nd millennium BCE, most of Turkey is occupied by the Hittite Empire. They, along with basically all of the major political formations of the Eastern Mediterranean that existed during the late Bronze Age, disappear or come to their end somewhere around 1200 BCE for reasons that are still very much debated. This is the famous Bronze Age collapse, after which the Iron Age begins, okay, and that lasts for 200, 300 years or so. This is the Iron Age 1 period, which is alternatively known or sometimes colorfully known as the Dark Age. It's called a Dark Age because we don't have a lot of historical information illuminating it for us. And so I can't actually really draw on this map a circle with some kind of political formation inside of that circle, because we don't really know what's going on in this period. But by about 1000, let's say 900 BCE or so, during the next Iron Age 2 period, we start to see a resumption of political complexity. In central Turkey, the region that had been occupied by the late Bronze Age Hittite Empire is now occupied by the Kingdom of Phrygia, which probably most of you have heard of. If you haven't heard of Phrygia, you may have heard of its capital city of Gordian. If you haven't heard of Gordian, I know you've heard of its most famous king, Midas, he of the Golden Touch. He was a historical figure, by the way, a real historical figure who would have lived and reigned during this Iron Age 2 period. Meanwhile, off to the west in the Aegean, this is when we start to see the rise of the famous Greek city-states that will become even more famous in their own right in the Hellenistic period. Off in the east then is the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, who at this time would come to conquer basically all of the ancient Near East by the 7th century BCE. And then sandwiched between these much more famous, much more well-known cultures, again, much more famous even to Near Eastern scholars, not just the public audience, are these Syro-Anatolian city-states, which is the subject of my book. So right around the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea is the region that we're looking at. And early first millennium BCE then is the time period. I should also add, if this map were a little bit larger and extended to the south a bit more, this would also be the time period of biblical Israel and Judah of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible times. So there's at least 4 very famous, very important ancient Near Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean civilizations that exist contemporary with the Syro-Anatolian city-states. So that's one of the main reasons why nobody's heard of them, because they're, of course, overshadowed by these titans of ancient Near Eastern reception. Another reason that they tend to be disregarded is because just sort of coincidentally, geopolitical borders are not helpful for them. The modern border between Turkey and Syria cuts right between where these dozen or so kingdoms existed. And that just has an inevitable tendency to balkanize scholarship. I mean, people work in Turkey or they work in Syria. It's just sort of the way things work. You develop relationships, you start to learn Turkish or start to learn Arabic, or you are yourself Turkish or you are yourself Syrian. And, you know, it's difficult to establish professional bureaucratic relationships across both sides of the border. And so that right away tends to cleave scholarship in two, which is already unhelpful. But there are ancient reasons as well. Most conspicuously, it's multi-ethnic, multilingual character. So there are multiple languages spoken in this Syro-Anatolian region, unlike Phrygia, where they spoke Phrygian, unlike the Neo-Assyrian Empire, where they spoke Akkadian. Here, it's a more complicated ethnolinguistic scenario. The first language that was spoken there is this sister language of Hittite, the Indo-European language of Luwian, which also uses, by the way, a completely idiosyncratic script called hieroglyphic Luwian. I personally love this writing system. It's absolutely bonkers. It doesn't read from left to right or from right to left, but rather from right to left and then left to right and then right to left and then left to right, sort of back and forth across the stele in a manner of writing that philologists know as boustrophedon, which is Greek for as the ox plows, because the ox will go back and forth across its field. Even while it's doing that, your eye is meant to be going up and down across these registers. So it's a really sort of bizarre system of writing. Meanwhile, at the same time, it's in the early first millennium BCE that an entirely new writing system starts to flourish, and that is, of course, the alphabet, which was used to record the Semitic languages of Aramaic, first Phoenician and then subsequently Aramaic. So you can see how these different linguistic communities of the past also has a tendency to fracture scholarship in the present. First of all, Luwian and Aramaic and Phoenician are completely unrelated language families. One is Indo-European and one is Semitic. So scholars obviously tend to focus on Indo-European languages or on Semitic languages. Likewise, the writing systems are so unrelated to one another that it's almost inevitable that scholars will have to specialize in one or the other. And so, right, people will become specialists in one of these domains, but not really have that sort of overarching bird's eye view of the whole phenomenon. Still, another reason why we don't know as much about this time and place as people like me would like is because we don't have a lot of native texts to begin with. In fact, most of our historical information and political geographical information comes not from the Syro-Anatolian city-states themselves, but actually from their much more powerful neighbor to the east, this Neo-Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire had a royal ideology of continual expansion, and on an annual basis would lead campaigns to expand its borders, and in the process would encounter Syro-Anatolian kingdoms. And these kings were horrendously boastful, and they had a habit of erecting steles of themselves, like this one from the famous 9th century ruler Ashurnasirpal II, and then covering that stele with detailed records of what they accomplished in a given campaign season. And those records are often quite detailed. I crossed such and such a river, I passed by such and such a mountain, then I encountered such and such capital city, which was ruled by this individual. He, of course, could not fight back against me. He succumbed to my might, and then I moved on and crossed that river and passed that mountain and came to the next capital city. And in the process of giving these detailed itineraries, it's from the Assyrian text then that we get most of our historical information to reconstruct things like king's list and dynasties and city place names. So we actually don't have a lot of native texts. These Assyrian sources are helpful, but of course the Assyrians were not themselves anthropologists. They're simply writing things for their own ideological purposes. And then finally, the last reason I wanted to highlight for why the Syro-Anatolian city-states are not better known is because they come to a pretty abrupt end around 700 BCE or so, when all of them have been conquered by the Assyrians. And why that end is fairly abrupt is because of the Assyrian habit of deportation. So after conquering a kingdom, the Assyrian kings would then uproot its population, scatter it around some other distant part of the empire, and then repopulate it with someone that had been conquered from somewhere else. And that really brings, a relatively abrupt end to this cultural phenomenon. So what then is the standard model for understanding these Syro-Anatolian city-states? Like I said, when I first started talking, I think the default answer, although really no answer had been explicitly given in scholarship by people who are working in this time and place, but the sort of default operating assumption underlying most scholarship that handles the late second, early first millennium of the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea has been the nation state. And the nation state, of course, is that strong relationship that we know so well from modern history between language and ethnic identity on the one hand and territory on the other hand. And, you know, they tend to, as I sort of joked when I first started talking, they tend to represent this map as if it looked like modern Western Europe with Italy and Spain and France and England and Germany, all of these very strong sort of linguistically demarcated territories that are the sort of epitome of what we understand by nation state. And sociologists refer to this default assumption that all things can be considered, all political formations can be considered nation state-like as methodological nationalism. That's also a bit of a mouthful. But that's just that sort of operating framework that scholars tend to use. And why do we tend to operate using that framework of methodological nationalism? Well, these same sociologists would say probably it's because that scholarship on the ancient world came to fruition at a time when the nation state was at its peak in the mid-19th century. I mean, it's not coincidental that scholarship on the ancient Near East arises in the mid-1800s at a time when the nation state is already extant in Europe, and it's being conducted by European scholars, of course. In other words, it's just part of the intellectual milieu. So the result of that then is an intellectual landscape that looks a little bit like this. So on the top register of this slide then are all of the books that have been written on the Luwian speakers, sometimes known as Neo-Hittites, because Luwian, by the way, is a language that was also spoken in the Hittite Empire. And so these kingdoms, these books tend to get written that are called something like the Luwians or the Neo-Hittite kingdoms. On the other hand, the people who tend to focus on the Semitic languages of Aramaic, the other language that is spoken in the Syro-Anatolian region using that Semitic language of Aramaic and that other writing system of the alphabet, will write books like the Arameans of the Iron Age, the Arameans, their ancient history, the Aramaeans in ancient Syria, a political history of the Arameans. I mean, you get the idea, right? You have scholars writing books considering kingdoms that are nation states for Luwians and scholars writing books that are nation states for Arameans, as if the two are not part and parcel of a larger region-wide phenomenon. And as a result, then there really hasn't been a unified model for the rise of the Syro-Anatolian states as a sort of holistic entity. And that's too bad, not simply because it's, you know, I felt like the time was ripe for someone to write something that treated them holistically, but it's also just sort of empirically misleading. It's just not an accurate representation of the ancient reality. So let me just give you an example of how this is actually quite different from the portrayal that scholarship represents. This is a slide that is representing the inscriptions, the royal inscriptions that were excavated from this one particular Syro-Anatolian kingdom that's called Sam'al. And that kingdom's capital city is the archaeological site of Zinjirli, which happens to be excavated by my colleague here at the University of Chicago, Professor David Schlum. And the results that he has produced and his team, and that were produced in the turn of the last century by the original German excavators over a century ago now, yeah, really illustrates well how the ongoing accumulation of evidence precludes tidy ethnic categorizations. We tend to think of this kingdom as Aramaean. If we had to sort of slot it into one of our two camps of Luwian Neo-Hittite on the one hand, or Aramaic on the other hand, we would usually characterize it as Aramaic because of inscriptions, royal inscriptions that are composed in Aramaic, or it's really closely related sort of subdialect Somalians named after this kingdom of Somal, in which only this dialect of it is found. So that's sort of the main reason why we would say that these are Semitic or an Aramaic kingdom. But the earliest inscription until recently that had come from this kingdom was written not in Aramaic at all, but in Phoenician. Even more bizarrely, that Phoenician inscription is authored by one Kulumua. I'm just going to pull up a laser pointer here. So these are the royal names. There's the royal name of Kulumua. Now, Kulumua, that is, of course, a Luwian name, and immediately recognizable as Luwian to anyone who studies this time and place, which is really bizarre. In fact, once we look at the rulers' names, we can see really interesting patterns happening here. This ruler Panamua, so here's another Luwian named king, has a father named Bar-Tsur, that's clearly Aramaic, and a son named Bar-Rakib, also clearly Aramaic. So we're switching back and forth between Luwian names on the one hand and Aramaic names on the other hand, even within the same dynasty. The same is true, of course, with this famous stele that the Zingerle team excavated, that's known as the Katamui stele. It made headlines at the time of its discovery, I think in 2007, maybe 2006 now, because it's considered possibly the earliest representation of the soul in an ancient Near Eastern text. This is a funerary scene of the individual Katamua, accompanied by a lengthy inscription in Somalian. But his name, of course, is Katamua, which is a Luwian name. And so this kingdom alone has generated like a veritable cottage industry of scholarship, trying to slot this information into some kind of historical rubric that would make sense according to the nation state framework. Like it must have started as a Luwian kingdom and then become an Aramaean kingdom. And then it must have gone back to being a Luwian kingdom at some point. Like that's the sort of logic that people are using. And it got even more complicated when this monument fragment was found in 2006 at the nearby site of Panjarlahuig. So here's the capital city of Zingerle. A kilometer to the southeast is this site of Panjarla. And in a field boundary wall using ancient boulders, they found this hieroglyphic Luwian inscription that the excavation team reconstructs as deriving from a monumental statue. So Luwian was clearly a major language also spoken and communicated within the boundaries of Somal. And so the fact that we didn't have Luwian inscriptions themselves at the time this table was made, that's presumably just the accident of discovery. And if we just spent more time excavating at this site, we'd probably find a lot more Luwian texts. And so the excavators sort of concluded the article presenting this inscription by asking, was Samal, this kingdom, first a Neo-Hittite state and then an Aramaean state, or was it an Aramaean state that occasionally used Luwian inscriptions? And what I propose in my book is that I think that kind of question has us looking in the wrong place before we've even begun asking it. Of course, there's a lot of these kingdoms that have produced inscriptions in more than one language. It's typically treated as a problem and one that's usually resolved by historical explanations that would try to explain why a kingdom might pass from one ethnic identity to another. And the more pieces of evidence get accumulated as fieldwork gets conducted every summer, like this, it's somehow never understood as a challenge to this association of ethnolistic identity and the state. And once things like this come to light and we realize that things don't make sense, well, we just say, okay, well, we have lack of sufficient documentation. We just need to find more evidence. But it just seems to me that the more evidence or documentation we discover, the messier our reconstructions inevitably become. And yeah, the more this association of ethnolinguistic groups and polity appear to be like strained attempts at foisting an inapplicable model onto an uncooperative subject, hence the title slide, Uncooperative Nation States. They don't behave the way that we'd like them to behave. And the more we find, the less cooperative they behave. So in my book then, I argue that rather than represent a historical puzzle that only gets harder and harder to solve every year as we find more and more stuff, maybe the messiness of this data reflects what was in fact a messy ethnolinguistic landscape, and one that really doesn't need to be connected to the political identities of the city-states in which these groups lived. So if that's the case, then we maybe should look for a different theoretical source for understanding a political identity at the time period, if the nation state is maybe not the best model. And what I turned to, just by coincidence, really was this literature on diaspora studies from the late 20th and early 21st century. It's not particularly cutting edge in the domain of cultural anthropology. As I say, this is like 90s and early 2000s scholarship. And it came to my attention sort of coincidentally when I was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins and was part of a interdisciplinary workshop group that met every 2 weeks. And anthropologists within that workshop were discussing this literature that I had never heard of before, and that seemed very interesting to me. And I started following up on it. And sure enough, it seemed to me to be quite pertinent to the time and place that I was studying. So I read up a little bit more about it. I'm by no means a specialist in this at all. I wouldn't pretend to be, but it seemed to be evocative of the problems that I was chewing on in the Iron Age. The point of this scholarship really is to resist assigning their cases, whether it's the Black Atlantic in Paul Gilroy's case, or whether it's contemporary anthropological questions in James Clifford's case. Yeah, not to sort of typological categories, but to focus on the cultural products or cultural forms that take place when groups of people are brought into contact with another. Like what happened at the Bronze and Iron Age transition. This is why I say it became interesting to me. They don't really emphasize boundary maintenance, but rather this body of work argues that like population scattering and gathering and the shuffling of polities' demographic compositions leads to an erosion of boundaries, actually, the boundaries that are highly fluid and change their dividing lines over time. And it's this sense of new communities being forged out of displacement that I thought applied so nicely to the Iron Age. So I liked this quote by Stuart Hall, and I thought this applied nicely, who understands diaspora as, quote, not by essence or purity, which would of course be the principle of the nation state, but by the recognition of a necessary heterogeneity and diversity, by a conception of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference. By hybridity. Diaspora identities are those which are constantly producing and reproducing themselves anew through transformation and difference. So we probably don't need to dwell on this too much, but the key for me in an Iron Age context is then not the understandable urge to separate cultural expressions into ethno-political typologies, but really rather to appreciate their interpretation. So the first step then from my book to make that argument archaeologically was to demonstrate that some sort of demographic shuffling was in fact taking place. In other words, that people were actually moving around the landscape in the late Bronze and Iron Age transition and bringing together then cultural traditions that hadn't been brought together before. And so that comes, with that then comes the archaeology of migration. And I tried to make that case that after the collapse of the Hittite Empire, a lot of their Luwian speaking population did indeed transfer themselves from the central Anatolian plateau into southeastern Turkey, North Syria. The first and most obvious piece of evidence for that is the widespread and dramatic increase in hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions that are found in the Iron Age in this region that really can only indicate a widespread sudden influx of people who spoke Luwian. Of course, these inscriptions are highly elite. Probably not a lot of people are themselves reading these Luwian inscriptions. But nevertheless, you wouldn't start writing in this language unless many people in the region were speaking that language. And just in case you think, well, these are only elite texts. Probably most of the people were not speaking, or probably the language of these elite texts doesn't necessarily indicate the language spoken by most people, which a lot of people do argue. There are, in fact, a small number of mundane sort of quotidian texts that are very poorly preserved. These are letters written on lead strips that are probably 2 to 3 centimeters long. Oh, okay, there's a scale here. So just to give you a sense of how small these documents are and how small the hieroglyphic Luwian carved into them is. This is a conservator's nightmare, by the way, unrolling these lead strips to preserve, to find the inscription that's recorded there. All they're recording is mundane economic transactions. I'll sell you these 3 sheep if you give me a quarter of your field, that kind of a thing. But these are the kinds of texts that prove that people in this time and place really did speak Luwian. They weren't simply using that language for an elite monumental genre. They were also themselves actually speaking it. Yeah, it wasn't simply a medium for display, in other words. So that's one major piece of evidence for demographic mixing in this time period, that there are Luwian speakers coming into this region that hadn't been there before. Another piece of evidence, and this is perhaps more controversial to archaeologists who are familiar with the archaeology of burial practices, is the sudden spread in southeastern Turkey and North Syria, the Syro-Anatolian region, of a new burial practice that hadn't been practiced there before, which is these cremations, which had been conducted extensively in central Anatolia. Now, in the late Bronze Age, in the period of the Hittite Empire, we actually don't have a lot of well-preserved cemeteries, so we don't know a lot about their burial practices, although Hittite texts are insistent that the way they buried people was through cremation. Archaeologically, we only have very minor confirmation of that. But in the preceding Middle Bronze Age, we have plenty of cemeteries that do indicate that cremation was practiced. And then again, as I say, this is the burial practice that seems to take root in the late 2nd and early 1st millennium in the Syro-Anatolian region. Really distributed across the Syro-Anatolian region. There's really extensive cremation cemeteries from Hamath, from Carchemish, some of the capital cities of these Syro-Anatolian kingdoms. And combined with the hieroglyphic Luwian linguistic spread, this seems to me to be evocative of, yeah, a movement of people, an actual migration of Luwian speakers coming from Anatolia into this region. Maybe the best way to prove this migration would be through settlement pattern analysis. So I'll just show some evidence for that here briefly. This is a survey that took place around the city of Carchemish, which is on the Euphrates River. This is probably the largest site in the Syro-Anatolian region. It's sort of the crown jewel of all of these city-states. And as you can see here, but from the late Bronze Age into the Iron Age, there's more than a doubling of the number of sites that are present there. Okay, so it seems like there's an influx of settlements. Likewise, here's just another survey that was conducted by my colleague, Glenn Schwartz from Johns Hopkins when I was a postdoc there, just maybe 60, 70 kilometers southwest of Carchemish. Here on the top left, you can see the late Bronze Age settlement distribution. On the top right, then the Iron Age settlement distribution. And again, there's more than doubling of the number of sites from the late Bronze Age period into the Iron Age period. This pattern is actually replicated in several different surveys throughout the Syro-Anatolian region, sort of burgeoning in the number of sites during the Iron Age that have been interpreted in a number of different historical ways over the years. But I would argue that probably one of the reasons for this explosion in Iron Age sites is because of newcomers that are entering the region at the time. You would expect to see then, if I'm right, a decrease in the number of sites in Turkey and in central Anatolia from the late Bronze Age to Iron Age, right? If people are leaving that region to move to the southeast. And here, unfortunately, the survey work has been less consistent and less cooperative. Partially, like the nature of the ceramic data that we use to date these sites simply isn't as strong here. And a lot of the surveys are older and less refined than is being conducted today. Nevertheless, here's just one example of a relatively strong survey that took place in the Konya Plain within central Turkey. And again, here you can see the inverse of the the Syro-Anatolian geographical pattern, right? Now we have a decrease from the late Bronze Age into the Iron Age, which is exactly what I would expect if I'm arguing for people moving from this region into the Southeast. So you put all of those lines of evidence together, and I think we can speak fairly confidently of a real demographic collision of at least a moderate scaled migration from central Turkey of Luwian speakers who are entering the southeastern region, where local Syrian populations, Aramaic language speakers have already existed. And that really brings two different cultural groups into contact at the late second and early first millennium BCE. This archaeology of migration I find a really, really interesting topic. And Aaron, if you're interested, you might want to ask about an ancient DNA project that's being started at the University of Chicago about this stuff. But I won't get into it right now. So Zinjali and the Katamua stele that I've already mentioned, that's again a strong case for showing the outcome of these cultural contexts. So as I said, this is an 8th century stele. It shows Katamua at his own mortuary feast. This is a common motif in Syro-Anatolian mortuary monuments, by the way. The text provides instructions for foods to be provisioned for various gods. Now, those gods include a variant of the Semitic deity Hadad, as well as Luwian deities like Kubaba. These are deities who are well known within their respective Luwian and Aramaic Semitic pantheons. And although the stele obviously belongs to a local mortuary cult, his own remains were not found alongside the stele, which is highly suggestive of Katamua's body having been subjected to cremation. So this stele really exemplifies the complicated ethnic nature of this time and place. There's a mixture of Luwian and Semitic deities. It's using a Semitic language, Somalian and alphabetic writing system, but Katamua himself has a Luwian name, and he's also apparently using Anatolian burial customs. So this is just a good example of how I can argue for the existence of like a single fluid and hybridized cultural formation that fluctuates in how it manifests specifically in different kingdoms and across the centuries. Yeah, like a cultural expression that selectively fuses elements of both major ethnic groups to create something new. So if I'm right about all of that, then we need a better term to describe these people. So the commonly used phrases like Luwian kingdoms or Aramaean kingdoms or Neo-Hittite kingdoms don't really work because they exclude groups that clearly belong in any given time or place. So in my book, then, I proposed calling this entire cultural system the Syro-Anatolian Culture Complex. There are a number of motivations that lay behind that term, not least that it provides a highly convenient acronym, SAC. It's just short and sweet. But first and foremost, I just think it's accurate. I mean, the culture is, if nothing else, complex. But it also allows us to accept the presence of like polity or kingdom-specific differences while simultaneously recognizing large-scale patterns of genuine commonalities. So my book then was devoted to establishing those patterns that cut across ethnolinguistic boundaries to recognize the larger culture. You'll note, of course, that I'm talking about the Syro-Anatolian Culture Complex, or SAC, but the book is titled The Syro-Anatolian City-States and Iron Age Culture. I would have liked to call it simply the Syro-Anatolian Culture Complex, but my editor at Oxford University Press wouldn't have that. I think he was saving me from myself. And we gave it the more poetic title, I guess, something a bit more evocative to people. But if I had my druthers, it simply would have been called the Syro-Anatolian Culture Complex. So yeah, the book is then trying to establish those patterns that will allow us to give that bird's eye view of a larger cultural phenomenon. And I'll just go through the evidence very quickly. I won't dwell on it here, but there are a number of patterns that are shared across all of these kingdoms, no matter what language was spoken, no matter who happened to be ruling at any given time. One of which was a common pattern of urban planning that divides all of their capital cities into hierarchically organized tiers of space, usually a 3-tiered capital city with a lower town, an upper city, and then a palace complex, all of which share a royal spatial ideology as well, with sort of strategically placed monuments of royal figures and inscriptions at highly specific public venues that are replicated city to city. Likewise, there's a shared monumental architectural tradition. This is the famous Iron Age palace known as the Beit Halani Palace, which again appears in all of these capital cities, or many of the capital cities, regardless of whether we're talking about a kingdom that one would traditionally call a Luwian kingdom or one would traditionally call an Aramaic kingdom. And also, by the way, a sort of running theme of my book is that SAC was highly influential on its neighboring cultures, even on the much more powerful, politically much more powerful neighbor, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So sometimes politics and culture don't run in the same tracks. And even though the Neo-Assyrian Empire was obviously much more politically powerful and indeed conquered all of these Syro-Anatolian kingdoms, SAC's cultural expressions had a deep and profound impact on Neo-Assyrian cultural expressions. And this Beit Halani Palace is one of those ways. The Assyrian kings will often make reference to how much they liked Syro-Anatolian palaces, the Beit Halani Palace, and adopted it into their own architectural repertoire. Likewise, monumental statues are iconographically very consistent all across the Syro-Anatolian region. I have a whole article about these, which I won't get into either. Their monumental arts are equally ubiquitous and equally sort of recognizably diagnostic to SAC. I don't think one would necessarily, without sort of a lot of highly specialized training in the art history of the Iron Age, otherwise you wouldn't necessarily notice a difference between, say, the so-called Aramaic city of Tel Halaf and its orthostat relief program, and the so-called Luwian city of Carchemish and its orthostat relief program. They're obviously sharing an iconographic tradition and a similar medium of artistic expression. And likewise, not just the way things look, but the way things are actually produced. This archaeological concept of chaîne opératoire. In other words, sometimes anthropologists and archaeologists will say that equally evocative of ethnic identity or identity in general is not the product, but the way something is being made, because that's highly culturally sensitive and culturally, imbued with meaning, right? That you learn to make things like textiles, which these tools are related to, that the textile industry. You learn how to make things like textiles in ways that are culturally significant. And again, we can see this exact same technologies of textile production at a so-called Luwian site like Tel Tayanat with a so-called Aramaic site like Tel Afis. So to conclude then, this label that I suggested in the book, the Syro-Anatolian Culture Complex, was intended to offer more than just a new terminology, but also a way out of the assumptions baked into methodological nationalism, like an awareness that out of these population movements came culture contact, and out of culture contact came the formation of a new, admittedly highly variable, but nonetheless broadly consistent and identifiable culture complex. And I'll just stop with that. And thank you all very much for a crash course in that book.
Thank you so much, James. Fascinating. And of course, as a reader of the book, I've got some questions, and I think you baited us with at least one about
Right.
DNA. But maybe to sort of contextualize the DNA and the kinds of questions that you'd be looking at, I guess one of the questions I would ask is that coming out of the late Bronze Age and that purported Dark Age, that is the black box of the Near East, right? Something goes in and something comes out the other end, and we've got to explain what happened inside the box. What processes, on the heels of the collapse of the Hittite Empire, and I don't know to what extent the demise of the Egyptian Empire plays into the southern, facets of your Syro-Anatolian culture complex, but specifically the fall of the Hittite Empire. How do you envision that impacting, the state of affairs in terms of social identity? I'm trying to skirt the word ethnicity, right? For these different city-states. How were they before, or that is during the late Bronze Age Hittite domain, and what do you see being the sort of actual on the ground process that's taking place? Are we looking at movements of refugees? Why are people fleeing a perfectly reasonable landscape up in Turkey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess my colleagues here at the University of Chicago, Hervé Reculo and Catherine or Katie Kearns, are Hervé is an Assyriologist and Katie an archaeologist. The two of them are very interested in issues of climate change and work closely with people like Stuart Manning. And although they would be the first to tell you that you can't make a one-to-one correlation between major historical events and climate issues, because those two corpora of data are not chronologically compatible with one another, they would also say that it seems undeniable that in broad strokes, the sort of late second millennium BC is indeed not a great time climate-wise, and that it's not unreasonable to think that that may have been a factor. So I suspect that one of the major motivations for people leaving the Central Anatolian Plateau probably was climate related. And there's also Hittite texts that speak to that issue, that there were major agricultural production problems and famine happening in the last years of the Hittite kingdom. So I suspect that was probably one of the major reasons for people trying to seek more fertile agricultural territory, which would have brought people into contact. And then your question of like the actual mechanisms of what does that look like on the ground, that's really hard to reconstruct. And I don't really have an answer for that. Like for people living in the Amuk, what would it have been like to have even just, let's say, 1,000 people come settle there over the course of 50 years? And how would they have integrated themselves in society? How would they have been intermarrying, joining one another's families? I think that's really difficult to reconstruct. And it's not even, by the way, the only migration event that we know to have been taking place, because I didn't get into it in this talk, but also happening at this time period is a small to modestly sized migration of people from the Aegean world that is also entering places like the Amuk. So there's actually multiple different identity groups floating around this region, bumping into one another, and whether that led to conflict and violence, or whether it led to new economic opportunities, and how exactly on a day-to-day granular level those contacts were negotiated. I just really don't know. It's such a fascinating question.
Okay. Yeah, I guess from there we can pivot to the DNA. Would you stop your screen share so we can
sure.
see the speaker, namely you, in full?
There we go.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the ADNA project there at Chicago that you're building into this broader study.
Sure, I'm really excited about it. So the University of Chicago noticed that some of our major competitors had these large, sexy DNA labs and wanted to get in on the action. As I'm sure all of you know, ancient DNA is sort of taking the field of archaeology by storm, in some ways unproductively, but in some ways very productively. And so the University of Chicago a few years ago hired an ancient geneticist named Mansa Raghavan, who and allowed her to create her own ancient DNA lab. And so once I realized that she was on campus, I thought, well, gosh, we have human remains from Anatolia in the Oriental Institute museum collections. Wow. And there's about 27, I think, individuals that the OI excavated from a site called Al-Sharhuyuk, which is in the Central Anatolian Plateau, and that's a multi-period site occupied from like the Chalcolithic period into the end of the first millennium BCE, with also later periods even on top of that. And so, I mean, excavated a long time ago, excavated poorly. The archaeological contexts are weak, but we can also C14 these human remains as well as do the ancient DNA analysis. So we're hopeful that we'll have a fairly good chronological distribution that will be able to show genetic continuity or discontinuity from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. And it should be hopefully very exciting results. We've just begun this process. What I can tell you so far is that the few samples that we have actually analyzed and taken to the DNA lab are viable samples. I mean, that's the first question. do the samples actually produce genetic material? And so far they do, but I'm not able to tell you yet whether DNA will become another support or challenge for migration models.
Yeah, well, without giving away anything, I mean, are you in discussions with others about sites across the SAC that can be tested?
You know, I'm not actually. And like a lot of the problems that, as I mentioned, most of these burials are cremation burials.
Yeah,
And
right.
that doesn't lend itself very well to ancient DNA analysis, unfortunately. So I don't know if there are other projects that from SAC that are doing that, or that have even found the inhumations that would lend themselves to it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose part of the problem is that a lot of that's in North Syria. Of course, certainly now it's not active. I mean, somehow Carchemish has continued, hasn't it, during the midst of...
Yeah, Carchemish continued despite being literally on the Syrian border, like the border between Turkey and Syria actually cuts across the middle of the site.
Yeah.
And the excavators on the Turkish side were going there even while they could see the ISIS flag fluttering a few hundred meters in the distance, which I just found a little unsettling. I don't think I would have done that myself, but each their own.
Yeah, you know, so I particularly find the whole, you know, model very compelling. I mean, it really kind of upends these rigid definitions that we have, especially when they involve polities or a certain political configuration across a landscape, that somehow, you know, we homogenize it. And I really like the expression, which, you know, it's always wonderful in anthropology how you can find a term that encapsulates a concept you could have, you know, you kind of know is there, right? So methodological nationalism is just, it's another form of presentism expressed in one area of archaeology, right? But I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on the implications for this for things like the Phoenician question in the Mediterranean or Greek city-states and the kind of highly homogenized views that we have about them, which are often based upon kind of reified notions of a complex that is somehow to be attached to a single label. You know, you think about the Ionian city-states and Western Anatolia in particular, and I've looked at those because I'm interested in the question of mercenaries in the later Iron Age. But you get at it and you start to realize the Ionians were really quite content to be blending at the intersection of the Greek and the Near Eastern worlds. And, you know, I don't know what, I guess you would say they were receptive to foreign traditions. So I'm kind of curious what, you know, what kind of thoughts, you also ran a conference just a few years ago on where you had people talking about the Phoenicians, right? And
yeah, so you mentioned edited books when I started. When you give the introduction, there's a yet another coming out shortly called The Connected Iron Age that comes out of that conference. That was basically centered around the questions of Aegean and Near Eastern interaction during the early first millennium BCE. And it, you know, I was relatively ignorant. One of the reasons I organized that conference and did this book was so that I could learn about Aegean archaeology of the early first millennium BC, which I'm largely ignorant of. And the Phoenician question in particular has, as you know, exploded in the past few years in debates about the nature of Phoenician identity. And one of the speakers at that conference was Carolina Lopez Ruiz, who will soon be at the University of Chicago, by the way, as a new hire here. And she launched a vigorous defense of the Phoenicians as more or less traditionally understood, that they were indeed a real Iron Age ethnic group. Even if they didn't necessarily call themselves Phoenician, they still had enough characteristics that you would sort of inevitably have to understand as being a relatively discrete and homogeneous cultural expression that they would have recognized and that their contemporaries would have recognized as well. Meanwhile, on the other side of things, there's people like Josephine Quinn, who's argued quite the opposite. And it's sort of her work that Lopez Ruiz was reacting against. So I don't know quite where to land on some of these things. I feel like some cultural formations, well, they just need to be taken on their own terms, I guess. Like when I compare SAC with, say, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, there I feel much more confident speaking about more or less discrete ethnic identifications, right? That Assyrians would call themselves Assyrians, that they recognize themselves as such, and that we as scholars don't necessarily need to replace an Assyrian ethnic understanding with some kind of contemporary anti-presentist anthropological model, right? It seems fairly commonsensical to apply it there in a way that it doesn't in SAC. And with some places like Phoenicia, I don't know, we're just going to have to see where the chips fall as more and more evidence comes to light, I guess, whether people like Josephine Quinn or Carolina Lopez Ruiz have more legitimacy on that debate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we've got this Getty Villa program going on. We're in the second year of it, where we're looking at, Phoenicians is really what has taken the stage this year as part of that program. And, many of the individuals who are behind these debates have participated. I guess the one thing that might be different there, and I'm just going to put my 2 cents in to make this more conversational, is that, it seems like, at least with the Phoenician question, you start out in a kind of contiguous, geographic zone, that if you're talking about people going out, yes, there can be a morphing down the line, but at least they're kind of close knit along the Syrian and Lebanese coast at an early point, that you can point back to an early time when they shared a common identity. The real question in so many of these ethnic studies, especially as the Greek deployed ethnicity of their own narratives, is that question of a shared background and whether or not it's actually fictive and constructed, or whether or not indeed they did share some point of origin, right?
I think that's right. And I understand the idea that the Tyrians and Sidonians and Biblians probably identify themselves by those cities and not necessarily by their some sort of shared identity amongst themselves, that they didn't verbalize themselves as part of a larger than city level organization. But I still got to think that people in Tyre and Sidon recognize themselves to be more or less similar in a way that they differed from people from Carchemish or Alashar. I mean, surely they recognize that they shared something that they didn't share with others.
Yeah, sets of deities, sets of dietary customs, for sure. Right. Yeah. No, very interesting. I don't know if let's see if there's any other questions out there. I know we've got some Lynn Schwartz Dodd joined us. I don't know if she has any questions. You know Lynn very well, right?
Yeah. Hey, sorry, I've been off on my video because I'm in a car actually.
Hey, no worries.
The parent driving this evening. Hey, James.
Hi.
Actually, you just alluded to a question I've been thinking through, which is just the dietary complex. Obviously your editor pulled the focus back into the city-states, and I know that I'm aware, for example, at Kinet, that there is some transformation in dietary practice, or at least the fallen remains, archaeobotanical. I'm not so sure. You have to forgive me. I don't recall if you've sort of summarized this because I jumped in late. And if there's any transformation visible there.
I don't deal with the dietary patterns in the book. I just have to plead ignorance a little bit, to be honest. I'm not sure what the data tells us about that. I just never went through the site reports, I guess, from kingdom to kingdom to see how dietary patterns were similar between them on the one hand, sort of geographically, but also diachronically, how that changed over time. I just don't have that off the top of my fingertips. I'm sorry.
No, I think it'll be an interesting area for those who are looking at the complex that you posited to extend that idea and kind of dig into it in various ways. And also, I think one of the really promising aspects of that is that there's a potential of as various other sites outside the city-state sort of centers, the monumental centers are examined, that maybe we'll be picking up some data to inform in that.
That's right, and how they compare to the capital city will be always interesting. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it does feel like that topic, Lynn, dietary and also DNA. We all know we should be doing these things, But it's like, oh, the next 50 to 100 years will address the questions we know we should be addressing. I mean, all these old excavations that you have to deal with, right, James? I mean, you've got Hama and the old excavations at Zingerle, and of course, challenges methodologically like that they had at Zingerle and more recent excavations with what's preserved, trying to recover it in the archaeological context, even with painstaking efforts. It's a really elusive one, but I will also always wonder when we talk about things like diet, if we'll get to that sort of melange that's like, yeah, we can't tell whether they was eating, Phoenician cereal for breakfast, and it was a good Aramean, barbecue for lunch, and it's different for every meal. And then, where do you pin the identity on the donkey, right?
Yeah, that's right. As for excavating a site that had been excavated before, I mean, Tynat was also one of those, excavated in the 30s, of course, and then re-excavated by Tim Harrison at the University of Toronto. And I was a member there for a long time. And I mean, we spent entire summers with trenches and pits thinking, is this a trench from the excavators in the 1930s, or is this a trench that was dug in the Iron Age? Or, we'd be convinced it was an Iron Age pit and then come to the bottom of it and find like a piece of cement. I mean, this kind of thing just happened over and over and over again. It was so maddening.
Well, Lynn, I didn't mean to cut you off. You have another question?
No, I mean, that's something I've been thinking about, and I know, we have the great good fortune of people continuing to work in this area, who are working, with contemporaneous methodological sophistication and capturing these things. I was also thinking about a colleague of mine who's working in sort of in America, broadly speaking, so Southwest and Central, and she's dealing with cremations predominantly, doing analysis of these cremations, and I recognize it's not ideal, but since there are whole bones that are preserved, has anybody actually tried those DNA analyses? I'm completely ignorant of this. I have no idea. I'm wondering.
So I've been told by Mansur Raghavan, my collaborator from the Human Genetics Department, that once a skeleton has been subjected to such high temperatures that the DNA is so degraded that even if a particular bone might be large enough to be sampled, that the DNA won't be preserved regardless.
Wow.
So, I mean, to the extent that holds true across thousands of samples, I wouldn't know. But I think once something has been torched, it's probably not going to be viable.
No.
Did you sort of draw a notional line when you created your the SAC line of inclusion and exclusion?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
So that's a good question. So the last chapter of the book, then the conclusion chapter is like, okay, well, just exactly what are the characteristics of SAC? And I come up with a list of like 10 things, and I'm like, this is more or less what I understand SAC to include in terms of material traits. And then, okay, where exactly is it then? What's in and what's out? And it seems pretty clear that what's in goes like north to the Euphrates to like Malatya, east to at least the Khabur Triangle, if not the Upper Tigris region, like Ziyaret, but certainly Tel Halaf. South, at least as far as Damascus. I mean, I would say still south of that, you're getting into the Israelite Judahite territory, which I would not include. And then really the question is, how far west does one go? So I would include Cilicia and the kingdom of Kue and Hiawa, Karatepe, Sirkelehuig, those kinds of sites. But then north of and west of the Taurus Mountains, the Tabal region, that's really the question mark for me. Would I include that part in SAC? I mean, there are obviously dozens of hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, but there's zero Aramaic. I mean, it really does seem to be more culturally connected to things that have been happening for a long time in Anatolia, especially the Hittite Empire. I think in the book I said it may be, it may not be. I tentatively will say it is, but that is really one of the major things, as Aaron also said at the beginning, that I'm using as a template for testing these ideas in my ongoing research, field research. So now I've started this new project at the site of Turkmenkarhuyuk that is within the sort of larger Tabalian region. And one of the things I'll be most interested in is, does this place look like a long-standing Anatolian settlement that's completely unrelated to things that are happening south and east of the Taurus Mountains, or could I lump it into my Syro-Anatolian Culture Complex?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested also in this idea of the complex and how it was perceived by, you know, others around. And I think it as not, I mean, you've produced this entity that can now be discussed and thought about as something a little bit more perhaps unitary, not exactly homogenous, but coordinated in various ways.
That's right. And kind of like I was describing for the Phoenicians, I'm sure someone from Tainat would understand that they have some things in common with people from Hama or Carchemish or Zindrali in a way that they don't have with people from Jerusalem or Nippur or Nimrud. You know, I just, right. I think it provides a certain sense of commonality that hadn't existed in scholarship before. At least that was the intent.
Yeah. Well, I remain curious as to how it's perceived by its, you know, by the contemporaries, and particularly, you know, Assyrians and their approach. Because I don't think that I had any good, and I don't think I had a very convincing idea about it. But I'm interested to see how using this as a kind of as a mode of discourse around this, you know, kind of. I'm putting my hands together because it's like, you know, something that sort of, you know, when you say, yeah, kind of a molecular sort of a thing that has places like these city states that your editor reeled you back toward, as you said. But then, you know, obviously has a reality that exists in places where it's less easy to see. And to what extent that is a formation that prompts, you know, any kind of patterning of action, reaction, interaction, you know, by contemporaries outside that area. Right. Again, I use my hands, but as you go on, in any case, I think that'll be an interesting thing to think through.
Yeah, agreed.
So James, if I can end on one question, and certainly there's more we could talk about this. Since you're relying on Neo-Assyrian evidence, and this sort of intersects with something that I've been looking at recently and sort of thinking about the implications of, which is, you know, what do the Neo-Assyrians call this region in sources? And Amuru is one of the names that gets thrown on there, you know, from, you know, ancient past that is somehow used on this region. And yet there's nobody who says, I am an Amorite or an Amuru. And yet it's this geographic label. Also, isn't it the case that Hatti sometimes is extended downwards to be seen in the Iron Age?
Yes. So Hatti is obviously Central Anatolia during the Hittite Empire period, but you know, I would think this would probably be another support for some kind of population movement into the southeastern region, because yes, by the Iron Age, the Assyrians are referring to that region as Hatti, to basically Sac. Or even more commonly, really what they're doing, what they identify this place by are the kingdoms themselves. I mean, they just say, they just really see it as a kingdom by kingdom kind of phenomenon. The way that I'm sure most people who lived in Sac would have said, I'm a Patanaean, or I'm a Somalian, or I'm a Carchemishian. And that really is the rubric by which themselves, but also their neighbors, the Assyrians, understand them. But right, I guess if the Assyrians had an overarching geographical term, it's Hatti.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us tonight. This was really wonderful. I think it'll be a great, you know, resource for people to check out and to see the conversations that you're engaging with and what your work has touched upon. So thanks for joining us.
This was great. Thank you for inviting me to do it. That was a lot of fun.
And thank you all for joining us and tuning in. And we'll put this up on our website and maybe put a couple of links to various and sundry things that we talked about today.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Good to see you.